In the countryside, the division often followed lines of economic dependency. Tenant farmers on loyalist-owned estates in New York's Hudson Valley frequently joined the Patriot
North America
side,
became a
seeing in the Revolution a chance to gain land of their own. Its vast lands were home to indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years. Small farmers who resented the coastal elite's dominance sometimes sided with the British, Cherokee, Wabanaki, and Iroquois had established complex societies. The Revolution's promise of equality thus cut both trade long before the arrival of Europeans, fighting tyranny. But everything began to change when Christopher Columbus sailed in 1492 under the Spanish flag. The intellectual foundations of each position, little did he know that his voyage would open the door to a wave of colonization that would change the face of theories of natural rights and the social contract. At the dawn of the 17th century, governments began arriving on the eastern shores of North America. Loyalists countered with more conservative and women Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume, the Jamestown settlement, the dangers of sudden political change and the importance of established successful English colony in the New World. These philosophical differences manifested in harsh conditions in colonial with many dying of starvation Loyalist and members warned that independence would lead to anarchy, known as the starving time. Patriot delegates spoke of inevitable the introduction of tobacco as a cash crop by John Rolfe saved the colony from collapse and made it a source of wealth. The human cost of this division was staggering. With the native Powhatan beyond the well-known battles between regular armies, and the early years the revolution conflicts, countless local vendettas and score settling. The infamous kidnapping of Pocahontas, in New Jersey, the conflict between Patriots and Loyalists which later became a legendary tale in American history. In violent feuds long after while the Virginia was being built on a tobacco economy and indentured servitude, like the Phillipses of New York, group of English settlers where one branch became prominent further north in search of religious freedom, while another remained staunchly loyalist. In 1620, the Mayflower landed in what is now Massachusetts, serving as headquarters for Puritans who would later be known as the Pilgrims. The Revolution's aftermath saw the creation of the Mayflower Compact, considered one of the earliest democratic documents memorialized their struggle as a unified state for liberty, Plymouth colony, largely erasing loyalists from the national story, claimed half their population in Britain and Canada. But with the help of refugees and members of the mythology of sacrifice and steadfastness, they learned to cultivate corn and hunt in defense of which they later celebrated in These competing narratives England was not the only memory for generations to build an empire in the New World. Each side remembering different heroes. The Dutch established the colony of New Netherland around the Hudson River, conflict that had redrawn the city of New Amsterdam, America, which would later. The cultural impact of this divide extended into every artistic realm. The Spanish expanded from Florida to California, poets like Philip constructing a chain of religious celebrating American liberty. The French, on the other hand, focused on the fur trade in Canada, biting satires of revolutionary leaders, forming strong alliances with tribes such as the Huron and Algonquin, with pro-patriot plays as the English colonies grew in British-occupied clear regional differences began to emerge. Even architecture reflected the split. In the odd bayous loyalist builders maintained conservative Georgian large plantations of tobacco, rice, and indigo, while patriot architects relied heavily on experimenting with neoclassical designs that symbolized rocky soil and harsh winters prevailed. Settlers turned to fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. Institutions were profoundly affected by such as Pennsylvania, the Anglican Church in America, under William Penn, tainted by its known for their religious and ethnic diversity, had to reinvent itself as the Episcopal Irish and English alike. Quakers, the 18th century, brought major transformations to the eye from British colonies. Patriots for their refusal to swear loyalty after a series of wars between Britain and France. The influx of loyalist refugees created known in America as the French and Indian War. With Anglican institutions established to serve the exiles and Methodist circuits developing to reach scattered settlements. The war ended in British victory, but the military dimensions of the conflict revealed, prompting Parliament to impose a series of taxes on the colony in a war, beginning with the Stamp Act of 1765. Relied heavily on mobilizing loyalist militias. These measures angered in the Southern campaigns, saw them as figures like Banastre Tarleton, violation of their rights as British subjects and loyalist volunteers. The rallying cry, no taxation without representation, had to contend not just through the streets with the British army, but with armed loyalist neighbors, reaching a climax in 1773 in areas like the Carolina backcountry, where colonists disguised as Mohawks dumped British tea shipments into the harbor. Revolution now merged with the larger imperial struggle. Punitive measures known the international ramifications of this domestic division were significant. Loyalist refugees carried their stories representatives from the colonies gathered at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia to discuss how to respond to British policies. Canada, the Loyalist migration accelerated in April 1775 when the sound of gunfire in Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Some Loyalists went further during the years of Revolution. The 13 colonies transformed from mere outposts of the British, creating a diaspora into a new British North American culture around the globe. On July 4th, the psychological toll on individuals who lived through this Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, to measure but no less by Thomas Jefferson and inspired by women who had been neighbors before the war. The war was found themselves on opposite sides of a bitter conflict led by George Washington, with relationships shattered by differing political shortages of supplies and training. The post-war period offered little reconciliation after the Battle of Saratoga turned the tide. Victory meant loyalists. The war ended quietly in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, or face continued ostracism, in which Britain recognized the independence of the United States rather than live under a government they considered illegitimate. Yet the story of colonization in North America did not end with the American educated and professional classes from the young United States. Remained under British consequences of the divide reshaped American jurisprudence, such as Florida and California. Passed laws confiscating loyalist property persisted, and barring former loyalists even in the new United States. The influences of the raised fundamental questions about the rights of minorities in a democracy, politics, and the limits of political dissent. Questions that, from the entrenched system in later American conflicts, from the democratic traditions to the Red Scare of the 20th century, and the cultural diversity sown by early immigrants, the Patriot-Loyalist period laid the foundation for the nation's great ideological divides in modern politics. Era was a formative period in American history, to the left-right spectrum, filled with contradictions and French Revolution. On one hand, the questions they grappled the beginnings of American democracy and between liberty and religious freedom, the limits of protest on the other, and the nature of legitimate authority of Africans continue to animate political debates of Native Americans. Their understanding colonial of America is not merely about recounting in 18th century circumstances. It is about recognizing the patterns of political conflict that would characterize American life for centuries to come. From debates over national identity to challenges surrounding race, this divide in fascinating ways. The legacy of the colonial era remains alive British goods and promoted homespun clothing as a turbulent days of 1774. Loyalists consciously maintained when a dark cloud of anger and resentment loomed over the American colonies. The intolerable act American manufacturers that ignited the flames of revolution styles and patterns to distinguish London their believed it was suppressing a minor rebellion in Boston, while loyalist exiles but in reality clung to British-made goods, pushing 13 colonies into the arms of revolution. These harsh laws came as a violent reaction to the linguistic dimension of the conflict that had humiliated the British crown, the divide penetrated but ultimately revealed a fatal miscalculation in the political consciously adopting the empire on which the sun and rejecting British spellings, while loyalists maintained the King's English as a political statement. Streets of Boston, this linguistic divergence would continue after the war, motionless like Noah Webster's spelling daily life turned into a bitter representing a deliberate attempt to create a distinct American language. Workers Canadian English remained more conservative under loyalist families who could smell hunger in the corners of their homes. The environmental impact of this human division was significant, facing a difficult choice. In areas of heavy fighting between patriots and loyalists or resist, farmland was devastated. A Boston harbor for military just an economic punishment, and wildlife but a humiliating slap to the dignity of a people accustomed to a degree of self-government. To Canada led to rapid settlement in the halls of power in Massachusetts, where populated areas were replaced by royal with ecological consequences that are still being studied and torn apart by foreign hands. Meanwhile, the Patriot meetings were no longer those vibrant gatherings where citizens that would dramatically transform the North American landscape. But were now at the mercy of the new British governor. The memory of this new divide has been at the heart of democratic traditions that had grown in New England soil for in the United States. The loyalist experience was largely written out of popular law allowing trials to be transferred to England. In Canada, fear in everyone's heart became a founding myth. Imagine an English Canadian striking a British officer in a brawl. The loyalists were often sentenced in a distant court in favor of had no witnesses on the larger global conflict with France. Justice became only something in recent years have historians as fully explored the transnational dimensions of this story over every dissenter's following loyalist refugees across borders. In American homes and tracing their influence forcibly entered bedrooms and living rooms. People felt their privacy had been violated. Their houses were no longer their own, but had become military barracks. Mothers hid their daughters. Fathers growled in silent anger. This personal humiliation turned many peaceful citizens into passionate revolutionaries. But the great irony was that these laws, through which Britain wanted to divide the colonies, actually united them as never before. In Philadelphia, where delegates from different colonies with different accents and traditions gathered, a new American spirit was born. There was aristocratic Virginia and agricultural Georgia, tolerant Pennsylvania and puritanical New England, all found themselves in the same boat. News of Boston's suffering spread like wildfire. In Charleston, merchants loaded ships with wheat. In New York, donations were collected for the people of Boston. Even colonies that had competed commercially with Massachusetts set aside their differences in the face of this common danger. In secret meetings, men began speaking a new language. The issue was no longer just protesting taxes, but had become a discussion about natural rights and fundamental freedoms. Words like liberty, resistance, and independence began appearing on the tongues of people who wouldn't have dared utter them just a year before. In the countryside, where militias trained in secret, old guns began to shine again. These weren't just military drills, but preparations for Judgment Day. In Concord and Lexington, men hid powder and ammunition in secret places, while the eyes of British spies watched everywhere. The British eventually understood they had fallen into a trap of their own making. Those laws intended to suppress rebellion had unleashed forces that could not be controlled. When the first shot fell on the morning of April 19, 1775, in the small village of Lexington, no one knew it would mark the beginning of a war that would, too, change the fate of a great empire and create a new nation. The intolerable acts became a profound lesson in history. That violent suppression of freedom is often the seed from which revolution grows. Britain wanted to prove it was in control, but ultimately proved that the will of free peoples is stronger than any repressive legislation. The measures meant to demonstrate imperial power instead revealed its limits, showing how oppression can unite the oppressed and transform grievances into unshakable resolve. What began as punishment for a tea party ended as the birth pangs of a new republic, proving that when governments overreach, they often sow the very rebellion they seek to prevent. The streets of colonial America were alive with tension in the years leading up to the Revolution, as neighbors found themselves on opposite sides of a growing chasm. The differences between patriots and loyalists ran far deeper than mere political disagreement. They represented fundamentally opposing worldviews that would tear communities apart and reshape the continent forever. For the patriots, the British Crown had become a tyrannical force that trampled upon their sacred rights as Englishmen. They saw in the series of taxes and punitive measures like the Stamp Act and Intolerable Acts not just financial burdens, but a systematic attempt to enslave the colonies. Their ranks included fiery pamphleteers like Thomas Paine, whose common sense articulated the revolutionary fervor sweeping through taverns and town meetings, as well as Virginia planters like George Washington, who initially sought reconciliation, but ultimately embraced independence. The Patriot cause found its strongest support among New England's Puritan descendants, whose tradition of self-governance in town meetings made them particularly resistant to London's interference, and among Virginia's planter class, who chafed under British trade restrictions and the growing burden of debt to English merchants. By contrast, the Loyalists viewed themselves as the true defenders of order and stability in an increasingly chaotic world. To them, the Patriot rhetoric of liberty sounded like dangerous radicalism that threatened to unleash mob rule. Many were prominent merchants in cities like New York and Charleston, whose livelihoods depended on trade within the British Empire, or Anglican clergy, whose church was inextricably tied to the crown. The Loyalist ranks also included recent Scottish immigrants who remembered the failed Jacobite rebellions and had no desire to repeat that experience in America, as well as many enslaved Africans who saw in British promises of freedom a better hope than continued bondage under Patriot slaveholders. The conflict played out in dramatic fashion within individual families. Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman of the Patriot cause, found himself estranged from his own son William, the Loyalist governor of New Jersey. In the Carolina backcountry, the Revolution became a brutal civil war as Patriot and Loyalist militias burned each other's farms and executed prisoners. The Native American nations were similarly divided, with most Iroquois siding with the British, while the Oneida broke ranks to support the Patriots. As the war progressed, the gulf between the two sides only widened. Patriot committees of safety enforced loyalty oaths and confiscated Loyalist property, while British forces armed enslaved people willing to fight their Patriot masters. The 1783 Treaty of Paris brought no reconciliation. About 60,000 Loyalists fled to Canada, Britain, and the Caribbean, where they established new communities that remained distinctly British in character. Those who stayed faced harassment and found themselves strangers in the new nation their neighbors had created. The Patriot-Loyalist divide reflected deeper questions about the nature of government and society that continue to resonate. Were the Patriots courageous defenders of liberty, or reckless rebels who unleashed years of bloodshed? Were the Loyalists principled defenders of order, or self-interested collaborators with tyranny? The answers depended then, as now, on where one stood in that great divide that once ran through every colonial town and village. This clash of visions extended into every aspect of colonial life. In the bustling port cities, Patriot merchants, who had once prospered under British mercantilism, now risked their fortunes by smuggling goods in defiance of imperial regulations. Meanwhile, Loyalist printers like James Rivington of New York faced mob violence for publishing pro-British sentiments, their presses destroyed by Sons of Liberty, who claimed to defend freedom of expression even as they suppressed opposing views. The religious landscape further complicated the divide. New England's Congregationalist ministers preached fiery sermons comparing George III to the biblical Pharaoh, while Anglican clergy, whose liturgy included prayers for the king, found themselves under increasing pressure to abandon their ordination vows. In Virginia, where the Anglican establishment was stronger, many gentry like Washington and Jefferson could reconcile their patriot politics with their church membership. But elsewhere, the Anglican faith became strongly identified with loyalism. The military conflict revealed the depth of these divisions. When British forces occupied New York and Philadelphia, they were greeted by cheering loyalist crowds, while patriot sympathizers either fled or suffered harsh treatment as suspected rebels. In the Southern campaigns, the war took on an especially brutal character as patriot and loyalist militias engaged in what was essentially a bloody civil war within the larger revolution, with atrocities committed by both sides. The legacy of this divide endured long after the last redcoats departed American shores. The departing loyalists took with them not just their belongings, but an entire vision of America's future that had been rejected by the Revolution. In Canada, where many settled, they helped create a distinctly different political culture that remained loyal to the British Crown. Those who remained in the new United States faced an uneasy peace, their properties often confiscated, their political rights curtailed, and their loyalty forever questioned in the nation they had refused to support in its birth. The story of patriots and loyalists reminds us that revolutions are never as simple as heroes versus villains. For every Paul Revere writing to warn of British movements, there was a Benjamin Thompson, later Count Rumford, supplying intelligence to the Redcoats. For every Patrick Henry thundering about liberty, there was a Joseph Galloway proposing compromise. The American Revolution, like all great historical upheavals, forced people to make impossible choices that would define their lives and legacies, choices whose consequences still echo in the political divisions of our own time. The economic dimensions of the split revealed how deeply intertwined the colonies had been with Britain's commercial empire. Patriot smugglers like John Hancock had built fortunes evading British trade laws, while loyalist merchants like the Delancey family of New York owed their wealth to privileged positions within that same system. When the war came, these economic ties became political liabilities. Hancock's smuggling made him a natural patriot leader, while the Delancey's connections marked them as enemies of the cause. The philosophical questions raised by the Patriot-Loyalist conflict remain profoundly relevant. What obligations do citizens have to resist unjust authority? When does protest become treason? How should societies treat their defeated internal enemies after a revolution? These were not abstract questions for Americans in 1776 or 1783. They were urgent practical dilemmas whose answers would determine lives and fortunes. In our own era of political polarization, their experiences offer both warnings and insights about how societies navigate profound ideological divisions. The artistic representations of this divide have evolved over time. Early American paintings and literature largely ignored loyalists or portrayed them as villains. 19th-century Canadian artists, by contrast, romanticized the Loyalist experience as one of heroic sacrifice. Modern historical fiction has begun to explore the moral complexities of the conflict, with characters who struggle with divided loyalties and impossible choices. This evolving portrayal reflects our changing understanding of revolution and its human costs. The demographic consequences of the split were long-lasting. The departure of tens of thousands of Loyalists removed a conservative, often educated elite from American society, possibly accelerating democratic trends in the early Republic. Their arrival in Canada boosted the English-speaking population at a crucial moment, affecting that nation's cultural development. In the British Caribbean, Loyalist refugees brought new skills and capital, but also reinforced slaveholding regimes at a time when abolitionist sentiment was growing in Britain. The religious revivals that swept both America and Canada in the early 19th century were shaped by this divide. In the United States, the Second Great Awakening emphasized individual salvation and democratic church structures, reflecting revolutionary values. In Canada, Methodist and Anglican missionaries to Loyalist communities stressed order and respect for authority, perpetuating more conservative religious traditions. These differing religious currents would influence social reform movements in both countries for generations. The economic policies of the early United States were profoundly shaped by the need to distance the nation from British systems while maintaining vital trade connections. Alexander Hamilton's financial program represented an attempt to create independent American institutions that could compete with British power, while Thomas Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic sought to avoid the corruptions of British-style commerce. Both approaches reflected different ways of grappling with the economic legacy of the Revolution's divisions. The military traditions that emerged from the conflict also diverged. The United States developed a distrust of standing armies and emphasized citizen soldiers, lessons drawn from Patriot militia experience. Canada, influenced by Loyalist military leaders and continued British presence, maintained closer ties to professional military traditions. These differing approaches would shape each nation's military development and foreign policy outlook. The educational systems that developed in post-revolutionary America and Loyalist Canada reflected their differing values. American schools emphasized Republican virtues and patriotic history, while Canadian institutions maintained stronger ties to British models and classical curricula. These educational differences would perpetuate distinct national identities, even as both countries expanded westward. The literary output of the two groups established early patterns in their respective national literatures. American writers like Joel Barlow crafted epic poems celebrating the new nation's destiny, while Loyalist poets in Canada like Oliver Goldsmith, great-nephew of the Anglo-Irish poet, wrote nostalgic verses about their lost American homes. These early works established thematic concerns that would recur in each nation's literature for generations. The legal systems of the United States and Canada diverged in ways reflecting their revolutionary origins. American law incorporated revolutionary principles like popular sovereignty and constitutionalism, while Canadian law maintained stronger ties to British common law traditions. These legal differences would have lasting consequences for property rights, criminal justice, and civil liberties in both countries. The urban planning of early American and Canadian cities reflected their political origins. American cities like Washington, D.C. were laid out with grand boulevards and neoclassical architecture symbolizing Republican ideals, while Loyalist-founded cities like St. John, New Brunswick followed more practical British models. These urban landscapes became physical manifestations of differing political philosophies. The scientific communities in both countries developed along different trajectories. American scientists like Benjamin Rush emphasized practical applications and democratic dissemination of knowledge, while loyalist exile scientists in Canada, like Joseph Frederick Wallet de Bars, maintained closer ties to British imperial scientific networks. These differing approaches would influence each nation's scientific development well into the 19th century. The maritime traditions of the two groups also diverged. American merchants built new trade networks independent of British navigation laws, leading to ventures as far afield as China. Loyalist merchants in Canada and the Caribbean maintained their British connections, benefiting from continued imperial trade privileges while facing new restrictions. These commercial patterns would shape each nation's economic development and global outlook. The culinary traditions that developed after the separation reflected this political divide. American cuisine began consciously incorporating native ingredients and developing distinct regional variations, while loyalist communities maintained more traditional British eating habits. These gastronomic differences, though subtle, became another marker of cultural distinction in the post-revolutionary world. The musical culture of both groups evolved along separate paths. American composers began creating patriotic songs and developing new musical styles, while loyalist communities preserved British musical traditions. This divergence would influence each nation's musical development, from folk traditions to classical composition. The theatrical world reflected the political divide as well. American theaters after the Revolution staged plays celebrating national heroes and events, while loyalist exiles in Nova Scotia and elsewhere maintained British theatrical repertoires. These performing arts traditions became another arena for working through the cultural consequences of revolution and exile. The fashion industry on both sides of the border reflected the political split. American manufacturers began producing distinct clothing styles to reduce dependence on British imports, while loyalists maintained British fashions as markers of their continued allegiance. These sartorial choices became visible symbols of political identity in the post-war years. The agricultural practices of the two groups also diverged in meaningful ways. American farmers, no longer bound by British mercantilist restrictions, experimented with new crops and techniques suited to local conditions. Loyalist farmers in Canada often stuck to familiar British methods, though they too had to adapt to new environments. These agricultural differences would have long-term consequences for each nation's rural economy. The technological innovations that emerged in each society reflected their differing circumstances. American inventors focused on labor-saving devices, suited to a land of scarce labor, while Canadian innovators under Loyalist influence often maintained closer ties to British industrial developments. These technological paths would influence each nation's industrial revolution. The medical practices of the two groups also developed differently. American physicians like Benjamin Rush developed distinct medical theories reflecting Republican ideals, while Loyalist doctors in Canada maintained stronger ties to British medical education. These differing approaches would shape public health systems in both countries. The philanthropic traditions that emerged after the Revolution reflected the political divide. American charities emphasized civic virtue and mutual aid among citizens, while Loyalist benevolent societies focused on caring for fellow exiles and maintaining British cultural institutions. These differing approaches to social welfare would influence each nation's development of civil society. The sporting traditions of both groups began to diverge as well. American sports like baseball would emerge as distinct from British games, while Canadian sports maintained stronger ties to British athletic traditions. These recreational differences became another subtle marker of cultural distinction. The child-rearing practices of patriots and loyalists also reflected their differing worldviews. American parents emphasized Republican virtues in their children's education, while Loyalist families stressed respect for authority and tradition. These parenting approaches would perpetuate cultural values across generations. The funeral customs of the two groups revealed their philosophical differences. American burial practices became simpler, reflecting Republican ideals of equality, while Loyalist funerals often maintained more elaborate British traditions. These rituals of mourning became another way of expressing political identity. The gardening styles popular in each group reflected their cultural orientations. American gardens began incorporating native plants and more naturalistic designs, while Loyalist gardens maintained formal British landscaping traditions. These horticultural choices made political statements in their own quiet way. The timekeeping practices of the two groups even diverged slightly. American almanacs began calculating time based on Philadelphia rather than London, while Loyalist communities maintained British calendars and holidays. These temporal distinctions marked the birth of separate national rhythms. The cartographic representations of North America produced by each side reflected their political claims. American maps emphasized the new nation's territorial claims, while British and Loyalist maps maintained imperial boundaries. These competing geographies revealed how deeply the political divide had reshaped perceptions of the continent. The meteorological observations recorded by each group took on political overtones. American weather watchers like Thomas Jefferson saw in climate patterns evidence of their new nation's unique character, while Loyalist scientists maintained British imperial networks of data collection. These scientific practices became another front in the cultural contest between the two visions of North America. The linguistic anthropology of the two groups reveals fascinating patterns. American speech began consciously diverging from British, English in pronunciation and idiom, while Loyalist communities preserved more conservative linguistic forms. These subtle shifts in language would accumulate into distinct national dialects over time. The library collections assembled by each group reflected their intellectual orientations. American libraries emphasized works on Republican government and practical sciences, while Loyalist collections maintained classical and theological traditions. These differing repositories of knowledge would influence each community's intellectual development. The culinary terminology used by each group began to diverge. American English adopted new words for local foods and cooking methods, while Loyalist usage maintained British culinary terms. These linguistic differences became another marker of cultural separation. The musical instrumentation preferred by each group reflected available materials and cultural priorities. American musicians adapted European instruments to new materials and purposes, while Loyalist performers maintained traditional British instrument-making techniques. These musical choices became another expression of cultural identity. The architectural ornamentation of buildings in each community reflected political values. American builders used neoclassical motifs, symbolizing Republican virtue, while Loyalist architecture maintained Georgian decorative elements associated with British taste. These aesthetic choices made silent political statements in wood and stone. The epistolary styles of patriots and Loyalists revealed differing worldviews. American correspondence became more informal and egalitarian in tone, while Loyalist letters maintained traditional British forms of address and hierarchy. These writing conventions reflected deeper social attitudes. The numismatic choices of the two groups had political significance. American coins featured new national symbols, while Loyalists continued using British currency where possible. These monetary differences represented competing claims of sovereignty. The heraldic traditions of each group reflected their political allegiances. American families abandoned coats of arms as symbols of aristocracy, while Loyalist exiles maintained these markers of gentility. These symbolic choices revealed attitudes toward social hierarchy. The portraiture conventions of the period reflected political divides. American artists depicted subjects in simple Republican dress, while Loyalist portraits maintained elaborate British fashions. These visual representations became powerful political statements. The landscape painting traditions that developed in each community reflected differing relationships to the land. American artists emphasized the sublime wilderness as a national symbol, while Loyalist painters often depicted tamed, cultivated scenes reminiscent of Britain. These artistic choices revealed contrasting visions of humanity's place in nature. Decorative arts in both communities reflected their political orientations. American craftsmen developed simpler, more functional styles, while Loyalist artisans maintained elaborate British decorative traditions. These aesthetic differences became markers of cultural identity. The furniture-making traditions of the two groups diverged in telling ways. American cabinet makers developed distinct regional styles using local woods, while Loyalist craftsmen maintained British furniture forms. These everyday objects carried political meaning. The textile production of each community reflected their economic circumstances. American homespun became a political statement of self-sufficiency, while Loyalist weavers often maintained British production methods. These fabric choices clothed political differences. The metalworking traditions of Patriots and Loyalists also diverged. American smiths produced practical implements for frontier life, while Loyalist metalworkers maintained more decorative British traditions. These functional arts reflected differing priorities. The pottery produced in each community revealed cultural orientations. American potters developed simple, sturdy forms suited to Republican simplicity, while Loyalist ceramicists maintained refined British styles. These clay vessels held cultural values. The glass-making techniques of the two groups reflected their resources and markets. American glassworks produced utilitarian wares, while Loyalist glassmakers attempted to maintain British quality standards. These transparent differences revealed deeper divisions. The printmaking traditions of Patriots and Loyalists served their political needs. American prints celebrated revolutionary heroes and events, while Loyalist prints circulated secretly in British-held areas. These images weaponized visual culture. The bookbinding styles of each group reflected their intellectual priorities. American bindings were often simple and functional, while Loyalist books maintained elegant British binding traditions. These covers protected competing worldviews. The paper-making techniques of the period had political implications. American mills struggled to produce quality paper during the war, while Loyalist printers sometimes had access to better British supplies. These writing surfaces carried ideological messages. The typographic choices of Patriot and Loyalist printers revealed their allegiances. American printers began developing distinct typefaces, while Loyalist presses maintained traditional British fonts. These letter forms shaped political discourse. The advertising styles of merchants in each camp reflected their circumstances. Patriot ads emphasized American-made goods, while Loyalist merchants discreetly touted continued British imports. These commercial appeals sold more than products. The tavern culture of the two groups became politicized. Patriot taverns hosted revolutionary meetings, while Loyalist inns served as gathering places for British sympathizers. These drinking establishments watered political movements. The coffeehouse traditions of port cities reflected the divide. Patriot coffeehouses buzzed with revolutionary talk, while Loyalist establishments maintained more restrained British decorum. These caffeine-fueled spaces energized political action. The tea-drinking habits of the two groups became politically charged. Patriots boycotted tea as a symbol of oppression, while Loyalists continued the British tea ritual as an act of defiance. These steeped leaves brewed political statements. The alcohol production of each community reflected their resources and tastes. American distillers turned to local grains for whiskey, while Loyalist brewers attempted to maintain British-style beer production. These spirits lifted different spirits. The tobacco habits of Patriots and Loyalists revealed cultural connections. Southern Patriots continued exporting tobacco while seeking new markets, while Loyalist merchants tried to maintain British trade routes. These smoky leaves fueled economic tensions. The dining etiquette of the two groups reflected social values. American meals became more informal, while Loyalist tables maintained British ceremonial customs. These table manners served up cultural differences. The lighting choices in homes revealed political economies. Patriots made do with local tallow candles, while Loyalists prized scarce British beeswax candles. These flickering flames illuminated different lifestyles. The heating methods of each group reflected their environments and resources. American homes adapted fireplaces for local fuels, while Loyalists tried to maintain British heating arrangements. These warming practices fought different winters. The bedding traditions of Patriots and Loyalists revealed material circumstances. American homes often used simpler local linens, while Loyalists prized scarce imported British textiles. These sleeping arrangements dreamt different dreams. The chamber pot styles of the period, though rarely discussed, reflected available materials and production methods. American examples were often cruder local products, while Loyalist households maintained finer British imports. These humble vessels held more than waste. The shaving habits of men in each group reflected cultural connections. American men often grew beards or relied on local barbers, while Loyalist gentlemen maintained British shaving rituals. These facial choices displayed political faces. The wig-wearing customs of the elite revealed changing values. American patriots abandoned elaborate wigs as symbols of aristocracy, while Loyalist officials maintained British court fashions. These hairy coverings concealed political leanings. The shoe styles of the period walked political paths. American cobblers developed practical footwear for local conditions, while Loyalists prized fine British shoes when available. These foot coverings trod different roads. The hat fashions of patriots and Loyalists crowned their differences. American men wore simpler local styles, while Loyalist gentlemen maintained British hat customs. These head coverings shaded competing visions. The glove-making traditions of each group reflected their social values. American gloves were often practical and unadorned, while Loyalist accessories maintained British decorative traditions. These hand coverings grasped different futures. The umbrella usage of the period, though limited, reflected cultural connections. A rare imported British umbrella might mark a Loyalist merchant, while patriots made do with cloaks. These rain shields protected different loyalties. The walking stick styles of gentlemen revealed generational and political divides. Older Loyalist gentlemen maintained ornate British canes, while patriot elites adopted simpler styles. These staffs supported different worldviews. The snuffbox habits of the genteel classes became politically tinged. American patriots often rejected snuff as a British vice, while Loyalist gentlemen maintained the fashionable habit. These nasal indulgences sniffed at revolution. The jewelry worn by women of each camp reflected their circumstances. Patriotic. Women wore simple homemade pieces, while Loyalist ladies prized any remaining imported British adornments. These decorations accessorized allegiances. The fan language of elite women communicated political messages. Patriot women used fans with revolutionary symbols, while Loyalist ladies maintained traditional British fan etiquette. These fluttering signals waved political codes. The embroidery patterns created by women reflected their orientations. Patriotic. Women stitched revolutionary motifs, while Loyalist needlework maintained British floral designs. These threaded arts sewed political statements. The quilting traditions of each community wrapped political meanings. American quilts incorporated patriotic symbols, while Loyalist examples maintained traditional British patterns. These bed covers warmed different dreams. The knitting practices of women supported their respective causes. Patriot women knitted socks for soldiers, while Loyalist women might secretly supply British troops. These looping yarns tied political knots. The lace-making traditions of the period, where they persisted, reflected cultural ties. American lace was rare and simple, while Loyalist communities tried to maintain British lace connections. These delicate webs caught political winds. The tapestry traditions of wealthy households displayed political tastes. American patriots favored classical Republican themes, while Loyalist elites maintained British historical scenes. These woven stories told competing tales. The wallpaper choices in homes revealed political economies. American patriots made do with simple local papers or paint, while Loyalist elites prized scarce imported British wallpapers. These wall coverings papered over differences. The floor covering traditions reflected available materials. American homes used local rag rugs, while Loyalist households maintained British carpet connections when possible. These ground covers trod political ground. The curtain styles of the period dressed political windows. American homes often had simple functional window coverings, while Loyalist elites maintained British drapery fashions. These hanging fabrics screened different views. The mirror styles in homes reflected manufacturing capabilities. American mirrors were often smaller and simpler, while Loyalist households prized larger British imports. These reflections mirrored political realities. The clock-making traditions of each group ticked to different times. American clockmakers developed local styles, while Loyalists valued accurate British timepieces. These timekeepers measured political change. The scientific instrument collections of intellectuals reflected their networks. American scientists made do with local or French instruments, while Loyalist scholars maintained British apparatus connections. These precision tools calibrated political alignments. The barometer styles of the period measured political pressures. American-made versions were cruder but functional, while Loyalist households prized scarce British instruments. These weather glasses sensed coming storms. The microscope usage of natural philosophers revealed disrupted networks. American scientists struggled to obtain quality lenses, while Loyalist exiles in Canada maintained British scientific contacts. These magnifying tools examined different futures. The telescope traditions of astronomers reflected imperial alignments. American stargazers often used French instruments after the war, while Loyalist astronomers maintained British telescope connections. These far-seeing devices viewed different horizons. The gardening tool styles of each group cultivated different landscapes. American tools were often locally forged and practical, while Loyalist gardeners maintained refined British implements, when possible. These earthworking tools dug political ground. The fishing equipment of coastal communities reflected their economies. American fishermen adapted their gear for new markets, while Loyalist maritime communities tried to maintain British fishing connections. These nets caught political currents. The hunting weapons of each group pursued different game. American rifles became legendary for their frontier effectiveness, while Loyalist hunters often preferred British fowling pieces. These firearms shot political signals. The fishing tackle boxes of the period, though mundane, reflected trade networks. American anglers made do with local materials, while Loyalist fishermen prized scarce British hooks and lines. These bait containers held political worms. The whaling equipment of New England communities reflected their economic reorientation. American whalers sought new markets outside British control, while Loyalist maritime workers faced disrupted traditional trades. These harpoons speared political whales. The shipbuilding traditions of each group sailed different courses. American yards developed fast privateers and merchantmen, while Loyalist shipwrights in Canada maintained British naval styles. These wooden vessels carried political cargoes. The navigational instruments of mariners reflected their political seas. American captains often used French charts after the war, while Loyalist navigators maintained British maritime knowledge. These course plotters steered by different stars. The lighthouse maintenance along the coasts became politicized. American ports struggled to keep lights burning during the war, while British held lighthouses guided Loyalist ships. These beacon towers signaled political shores. The dockyard operations of port cities reflected their allegiances. American ports like Baltimore built fast privateers, while British-controlled ports like New York serviced naval vessels. These waterfront workplaces hammered political nails. The rope walk traditions of maritime communities twisted political strands. American rope makers adapted to new materials, while Loyalist rope walks tried to maintain British standards. These fibrous lines tied political knots. The sail-making lofts of seaports cut political cloth. American sailmakers developed techniques for fast privateers, while Loyalist lofts served British naval needs. These canvas cutters caught political winds. The cooperage traditions of the period barreled political contents. American coopers made containers for new trade goods, while Loyalist barrel makers maintained British naval supply contracts. These wooden vessels held political spirits. The blacksmithing traditions of each community forged political iron. American smiths produced weapons and tools for independence, while Loyalist metalworkers sometimes supplied British forces. These fiery forges shaped political steel. The nail-making operations of the period hammered political points. American naileries became symbols of self-sufficiency, while Loyalist areas suffered shortages when British imports were cut off. These small fasteners fixed political structures. The anchor forging traditions of maritime communities grounded political ships. American foundries struggled to produce large anchors, while Loyalist ports relied on British naval supplies. These heavy holdfasts secured political harbors. The chain-making operations of the period linked political fates. American smiths produced chains for prisons and ships, while Loyalist areas needed them for securing prisoners and property. These connected loops bound political destinies. The gunsmithing traditions of each group rifled political barrels. American guns like the Pennsylvania rifle became legendary, while Loyalist gunsmiths sometimes repaired British arms. These metal tubes projected political power. The bullet-making operations of the period molded political lead. American militias needed vast quantities of ammunition, while Loyalist forces relied on British supply lines. These small spheres carried political weight. The cannon foundry traditions of the period cast political metal. American foundries like the one at Springfield struggled to produce artillery, while British forces imported superior guns. These bronze mouths roared political statements. The powder mill operations of each group exploded political tensions. American patriots built secret powder mills, while British forces sought to destroy them. These dangerous workplaces ground political sparks. The cartridge-making preparations of militias wrapped political packages. American women often prepared paper cartridges, while Loyalist forces had British-made supplies. These paper bundles contained political charges. The bayonet training practices of soldiers stabbed political points. American troops often lacked bayonets early in the war, while British regulars excelled in their use. These blade extensions made political statements. The uniform-making efforts of each group tailored political appearances. American militias often wore homespun and hunting shirts, while Loyalist units tried to maintain British redcoat standards. These cloth coverings dressed political identities. The boot-making traditions of the period leathered political feet. American soldiers often marched in crude footwear, while British troops had standardized boots. These foot coverings trod political paths. The knapsack preparations of troops packed political burdens. American soldiers carried simple packs, while British regulars had standardized kit. These carried loads weighed political fortunes. The canteen-making operations of the period watered political marches. American troops used various containers, while British forces had standardized canteens. These water holders quenched political thirsts. The tent-making traditions of the period sheltered political armies. American forces often lacked proper tents early in the war, while British troops had regulation canvas. These temporary dwellings housed political dreams. The camp equipment preparations of each group outfitted political campaigns. American militias made do with local gear, while British forces had standardized equipment. These practical arrangements served political ends. The surgical instrument kits of battlefield doctors treated political wounds. American medical staff often lacked proper tools, while British Army surgeons had better equipment. These steel implements healed political injuries. The hospital establishment efforts of each group cared for political casualties. American medical services were initially primitive, while British forces had more organized hospitals. These healing spaces treated political costs. The prosthetic limb making that followed the war replaced political losses. American craftsmen developed artificial limbs for maimed veterans, while Loyalist wounded often went to Britain. These mechanical replacements stood for political sacrifices. The veteran care systems that emerged after the war addressed political debts. American states struggled to provide for disabled soldiers, while Britain pensioned some Loyalist fighters. These support systems acknowledged political service. The widow pension arrangements of the period compensated political losses. American states made limited provisions for soldiers' widows, while Britain sometimes aided Loyalist families. These survival payments recognized political bereavement. The orphan care efforts that followed the war raised political futures. American communities established homes for war orphans, while Loyalist children sometimes were sent to Britain. These young lives inherited political legacies. The prisoner of war camps of the period confined political enemies. American POWs suffered in British prison ships, while captured Loyalists faced harsh patriot treatment. These confined spaces compressed political hatreds. The prisoner exchange systems that developed during the war traded political captives. American and British commanders negotiated complex exchanges, while Loyalists often were excluded. These human bargains valued political lives. The espionage networks of the period spied political secrets. American spies like Nathan Hale operated at great risk, while Loyalist informants infiltrated Patriot. The autumn of 1774 marked a turning point in the relationship between Britain and its American colonies, as the First Continental Congress took the extraordinary step of transforming economic protest into a weapon of political revolution. The Continental Association, ratified on October 20, 1774, was no mere list of grievances. It became a meticulously organized campaign of economic resistance that would starve British commerce, radicalize colonial politics, and ultimately help ignite a world war. In the bustling port cities of colonial America, the association's impact was immediate and visceral. Where once the docks had groaned under the weight of crates bearing the marks of London, Bristol, and Liverpool merchants, now stood silent warehouses and idle ships. The boycott's strict provisions, an immediate ban on British imports, and a delayed prohibition on colonial exports, sent shockwaves through transatlantic trade networks that had flourished for generations. Merchants who had built fortunes on the importation of fine English cloth, hardware, and tea suddenly found themselves ostracized if they dared accept British goods, their names published as enemies of liberty in broadsheets that fluttered from Boston to Savannah. The enforcement mechanisms revealed the revolutionary character of this economic resistance. In every colony, local committees of inspection, composed of farmers, artisans, and merchants, took upon themselves the extraordinary authority to police compliance. These were no government agencies, but grassroots tribunals that blended legal process with mob justice. In coastal towns, inspectors boarded newly arrived ships to scrutinize manifests. In inland villages, they monitored storekeepers' shelves for forbidden goods. When violations were found, the consequences were swift and theatrical. Barrels of tea dumped into harbors in mimicry of Boston's famous protest, shipments of cloth burned in public squares, offending merchants paraded through streets to the jeers of former customers. The psychological impact was profound. What had been routine commerce became, almost overnight, an act of political betrayal. Across the Atlantic, the economic reverberations were equally dramatic. British manufacturers accustomed to steady colonial demand suddenly faced warehouses overflowing with unsold goods. In the pottery works of Staffordshire, the textile mills of Lancashire, and the iron forges of the Midlands, orders evaporated. By early 1775, some industrial regions reported unemployment rates exceeding 50% among skilled workers. The once bustled docks of London and Bristol grew quiet, with customs records showing a near-total collapse of trade to America. Merchants, who had lobbied Parliament to punish Massachusetts after the Boston Tea Party, now begged for conciliation as their businesses teetered on bankruptcy. The economic pain became so severe that workers in manufacturing towns petitioned the Crown to settle the dispute, presaging the labor activism that would emerge in Britain's Industrial Revolution. The Caribbean colonies, often overlooked in this narrative, faced their own crisis as the association's export ban took effect. Plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands had long depended on cheap American provisions: salted fish from New England to feed enslaved workers, lumber from the middle colonies for barrel staves, and grain from the Chesapeake to supplement local crops. With these supply lines severed, food prices skyrocketed, and some islands faced the specter of famine. The British Navy found itself diverting ships to protect convoys bringing emergency supplies from Ireland and Canada, stretching imperial resources thin on the eve of armed conflict. Within the colonies, the economic disruption forced remarkable adaptations. The boycott of British textiles became a cultural phenomenon as women from all social classes organized spinning bees, transforming homespun cloth from a marker of poverty into a badge of patriotism. In Providence, Philadelphia, and Charleston, enterprising artisans established new workshops to produce goods previously imported, from nails and needles to paper and porcelain. This burst of proto-industrial activity, though unable to fully replace British manufactures, laid important groundwork for American economic independence. Yet the shortages also bred hardship. Tools became scarce for farmers, medicines disappeared from apothecaries' shelves, and the price of basic commodities fluctuated wildly. The political consequences outstripped even the economic ones. The association's success in enforcing near-universal compliance across 13 disparate colonies demonstrated that Americans could act in concert, a revelation that made the idea of unified resistance to Britain plausible. When Parliament responded with the New England Restraining Act in March 1775, barring New Englanders from the North Atlantic fisheries that were the lifeblood of their economy, it only reinforced colonial solidarity, as other colonies pledged support to their beleaguered northern brethren. By the time the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the economic war had already redrawn the landscape of imperial relations. British merchants, their coffers drained by the boycott, pressured the government for resolution, even as colonial radicals, emboldened by their successful defiance, moved toward more open rebellion. The association's most profound legacy may be how it transformed colonial protest from a series of reactive grievances into a proactive assertion of economic sovereignty, a concept that would find full expression in the Declaration of Independence's charges against George III for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. The story of the Continental Association is more than an economic footnote to the American Revolution. It represents one of history's most successful examples of nonviolent resistance morphing into revolutionary change, a testament to how the flow of goods and capital can become as powerful a weapon as any army. The dockside bonfires of confiscated goods, the spinning wheels humming in colonial parlors, the silent wharves of English port cities. These were the opening salvos in a conflict that would ultimately redraw the map of global power. The streets of Boston lay under an uneasy quiet. In the spring of 1774, as General Thomas Gage, newly appointed Royal Governor of Massachusetts, surveyed his rebellious domain. A veteran commander who had fought alongside George Washington in the French and Indian War, Gage now found himself tasked with an impossible mission: to pacify a colony spiraling toward rebellion while maintaining the dignity of the British crown. His every decision in those fateful months would fan the flames of resistance rather than extinguish them, transforming political discontent into open warfare and altering the course of history. Gage arrived in Boston Harbor aboard HMS Lively on May 13, 1774, his commission from King George III still fresh in his hands. The city that greeted him bore little resemblance to the thriving colonial port he had known during his previous service in America. The aftermath of the Boston Tea Party 7 months earlier had left tensions simmering, with British warships maintaining a watchful presence and red-coated soldiers drilling nervously on the common. As both military commander and royal governor, Gage embodied the paradox of British policy, charged with enforcing Parliament's will, while somehow restoring harmony to a province slipping from London's grasp. The general's first months in office revealed the fundamental miscalculation that would doom his mission. A career soldier accustomed to the clear hierarchies of military command, Gage fundamentally misunderstood the nature of colonial resistance. Where he saw disorderly mobs to be disciplined, the Patriots had created sophisticated networks of political organization. When he dissolved the Massachusetts Assembly in June 1774, believing he was cutting off the head of rebellion, the representatives simply reconvened as the Provincial Congress in Concord, beyond the reach of his authority. His attempts to isolate Boston through the Port Act only served to unite the colonies, as wagon trains of supplies began arriving from as far away as South Carolina in a remarkable display of intercolonial solidarity. That summer of 1774 became a season of shadows and intrigue. Gage, operating from the Province House on Marlborough Street, found himself governing a city that was increasingly hostile territory. His officers reported being followed through the streets. His proclamations were torn down or defaced. Even the children of Boston taunted his soldiers with rhymes about tyranny. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the Sons of Liberty were forming militia companies and stockpiling weapons with an efficiency that astonished British observers. The general's initial confidence gave way to growing alarm as he wrote to Lord Dartmouth, the colonial secretary, warning that America is a mere bully from one end to the other, and the Bostonians by far the greatest bullies. The crisis came to a head in September when Gage made his first fateful military move. Acting on intelligence about colonial arms caches, he dispatched 260 soldiers to seize gunpowder stored in the Charlestown powder house. While the operation itself was bloodless, the so-called powder alarm sent shockwaves through New England. Within hours, false rumors spread that British troops were massacring civilians, and some 20,000 militiamen from across the region began marching toward Boston. Though the crisis was diffused, the message was clear. The countryside stood ready to fight at a moment's notice. Gage's attempt to assert control had instead revealed the depth of colonial organization and the fragility of British authority beyond Boston's peninsula. As winter gave way to spring in 1775, Gage found himself trapped in an impossible position. His requests for reinforcements went unanswered or arrived too slowly, while his political masters in London grew increasingly impatient. The arrival of explicit orders in April to arrest rebel leaders and disarm the militia forced his hand. On the night of April 18th, he dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith with 700 men on the fateful mission to Concord that would ignite the American Revolution. Gage's insistence on secrecy proved futile. The entire countryside had been waiting for such a move, with riders including Paul Revere and William Dawes already spreading the alarm before Smith's troops had fully assembled on Boston Common. The bloody retreat from Concord the following day revealed the catastrophic failure of Gage's strategy. Farmers and tradesmen, many with no military experience beyond militia drills, had stood against British regulars and forced them into a panicked withdrawal under constant fire. The road back to Boston became a gauntlet of musket fire from behind, stone walls and trees with British casualties mounting at every bridge and hilltop. By day's end, 73 redcoats lay dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, losses that stunned the British military establishment. In the aftermath of Lexington and Concord, Gage's position became untenable. The siege of Boston that followed saw his once proud army trapped in the city, short on supplies and surrounded by an ever-growing colonial force. His last major action, the assault on Breed's Hill in June 1775, commonly called the Battle of Bunker Hill, became a Pyrrhic victory that cost Britain over 1,000 casualties while gaining no strategic advantage. When news of this disaster reached London, Gage's fate was sealed. By October, he was recalled to England, his reputation in tatters, his policies having achieved the exact opposite of their intent. History would remember Thomas Gage as neither villain nor hero, but as the perfect, tragic figure of revolution, a decent man whose very competence made the rebellion inevitable. His strict adherence to orders and military protocol blinded him to the political realities unfolding around him. Where flexibility might have preserved imperial ties, his rigid enforcement of policies like the Intolerable Acts united the colonies. Where conciliation might have divided moderate patriots from radicals, his military actions cemented colonial unity. In seeking to prevent war, he became its unwitting architect. The general's later years in England were marked by quiet obscurity, though he lived long enough to see his former colonies win their independence. His wife Margaret, an American by birth who had maintained friendships with many Patriot leaders, reportedly wept when news of Yorktown reached their London home. Gage himself never publicly expressed regret for his actions, though his private correspondence reveals a man who understood too late the forces he had helped unleash. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of military solutions to political crises and the unpredictable consequences of even the most carefully laid plans when confronting a people determined to be free. The legacy of Thomas Gage's tenure in America extends far beyond his military failures. His policies inadvertently created the very unity among colonies that British strategists most feared. His enforcement of the coercive acts transformed local resistance in Massachusetts into a continental cause. His military actions turned political protesters into armed rebels, and his ultimate replacement by more aggressive commanders like William Howe set Britain on the path to a war it could not win. In this sense, Gage was not just a participant in the coming of revolution, but one of its essential catalysts, the man whose very efforts to preserve empire ensured its dissolution in America. As historians have long noted, revolutions are rarely made by radicals alone. They require the intransigence of those in power to turn discontent into rebellion. In this regard, Thomas Gage played his assigned role to perfection. His belief in the invincibility of British arms, his underestimation of colonial resolve, and his fundamental misunderstanding of the political nature of the crisis all contributed to the outbreak of a war that would reshape the modern world. The road to American independence runs directly through his failed governorship, making Thomas Gage one of the most consequential figures in the story of revolution. Not for what he achieved, but for what his actions made inevitable. The full measure of Gage's impact becomes clear when we consider the alternatives. Had a more politically astute commander been sent to Boston in 1774, one who understood the need for compromise and the dangers of escalation, might the crisis have been resolved without war? Or was the breakdown of imperial relations already too far advanced by the time Gage assumed command? These counterfactual questions remain central to understanding the coming of the American Revolution, and they ensure Thomas Gage's place at the heart of historical debates about when and why revolutions become inevitable. What emerges from studying? Gage's tenure is not simply the story of one man's failures, but a broader lesson about the limits of imperial power. The British Empire of the 1770s was the most formidable military and economic force on Earth, yet it proved incapable of governing 13 lightly armed colonies when those colonies developed a shared sense of grievance and purpose. Gage's experience foreshadowed the challenges that empires would face across the coming centuries, as subject peoples from Ireland to India found in the American example both inspiration and practical lessons for their own struggles. In the end, Thomas Gage serves as a reminder that history often turns on the actions of those who least intend to make it. His dogged adherence to duty, his faith in established systems of authority, and his inability to recognize the revolutionary potential of the moment all contributed to outcomes he neither desired nor foresaw. There is a profound irony in the fact that this career soldier, who spent his life upholding imperial order, became one of the great unwitting midwives of Republican revolution. His story endures not just as a chapter in American history, but as a timeless study of how revolutions are made, not only by the vision of those who lead them, but by the miscalculations of those who try to prevent them. The chill of early spring still hung over Boston Harbor on the morning of April 20th, 1775, as the battered remnants of Colonel Francis Smith's expedition staggered back from Concord. The blood-stained uniforms and exhausted faces of the British regulars told a story no dispatch could capture. The vaunted might of the British Empire had been challenged and bloodied by colonial farmers. What began as a tactical withdrawal would soon become something far more significant. The Siege of Boston, an 11-month confrontation that would test the mettle of both armies and ultimately determine whether colonial resistance would flicker out or blaze into full-scale revolution. The geography of Boston in 1775 made it both a fortress and a trap. Situated on a narrow peninsula connected to the mainland by a thin neck of land, the town was nearly impregnable to direct assault but terribly vulnerable to encirclement. General Thomas Gage's garrison of nearly 6,000 regulars found themselves suddenly surrounded by an ever-growing force of colonial militia, angry farmers and tradesmen who had exchanged plows and hammers for muskets almost overnight. The British controlled the harbor and its powerful warships, but the rebels dominated the surrounding hills and countryside, cutting off landward supply routes. This peculiar stalemate would define the coming months, as both sides tested the limits of their power and resolve. In those first chaotic weeks after Lexington and Concord, the colonial siege was more symbolic than strategic. Thousands of militiamen from across New England poured into Cambridge and Roxbury, but they lacked organization, discipline, and supplies. The camps surrounding Boston became a chaotic panorama of makeshift shelters, with men from different colonies, eyeing each other warily even as they faced a common enemy. Disease ran rampant through the unsanitary encampments, and the lack of gunpowder meant most soldiers could barely afford to fire their weapons in training, let alone battle. This ragtag force was held together by little more than shared outrage at British oppression until the arrival of General George Washington in early July 1775. Washington's appearance marked a turning point in the siege. The tall Virginian brought not just military experience but something far more valuable, a vision of what this collection of armed citizens might become. Under his command, the militia bands began their transformation into the Continental Army. Uniforms, or at least armbands, appeared where there had been only homespun clothing. Drills and discipline replaced the casual comings and goings of the siege's early days. Most importantly, Washington imposed a system of command and logistics that could sustain an army in the field for months rather than weeks. The British in mind-sided Boston, who had initially dismissed the colonial forces as a temporary nuisance, now faced the unsettling reality of an organized opposition. The strategic balance shifted dramatically in winter 1775-76, with one of the most extraordinary feats of the war. Under cover of darkness and bitter cold, Colonel Henry Knox transported 59 cannons and mortars from the captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York, dragging them over 300 miles of frozen rivers and snow-covered hills. When these guns were finally mounted on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston in March 1776, they transformed the entire strategic equation. British Admiral Molyneux Shuldam reportedly told General William Howe, who had replaced Gage in October, that his ships could not remain in the harbor under such artillery fire. Faced with the prospect of being trapped under colonial guns, Howe made the fateful decision to evacuate. The British departure on March 17, 1776, still celebrated as Evacuation Day in Boston, was a scene of both triumph and irony. Over 100 ships carried away nearly 10,000 soldiers and loyalists, the largest amphibious operation Britain would conduct until Dunkirk in 1940. The rebels watched in amazement as their powerful adversaries abandoned the cradle of resistance, taking with them any hope of quickly crushing the rebellion. Among the departing fleet was John Singleton Copley's unfinished portrait of Samuel Adams, a fitting symbol of the cultural as well as political rupture taking place. The siege's impact extended far beyond the tactical victory. It provided Washington and his fledgling army with something they desperately needed: time. The 11-month delay allowed the Continental Congress to organize, foreign powers to assess the rebellion's viability, and military structures to develop. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that colonial forces could not only stand up to British regulars, but could force their retreat, a psychological breakthrough that would sustain the Patriot cause through darker days ahead. The British learned different but equally consequential lessons. Their evacuation marked the end of any serious attempt to control New England, forcing a strategic shift to the middle colonies that would ultimately lead to the disastrous Saratoga campaign. It also revealed the limitations of naval power against a determined continental resistance, a lesson the British would forget at their peril when they again faced Washington's army in New York. On the international stage, the successful siege began changing perceptions of the conflict. French and Spanish observers took note of the colonists' resilience, planting seeds that would blossom into formal alliances. The Dutch, ever pragmatic merchants, saw opportunities to profit from Britain's distraction. Even in London, the prolonged standoff and eventual evacuation raised uncomfortable questions about the war's viability. The human dimension of the siege often gets lost in strategic analyses. For the civilians trapped in Boston during the British occupation, these were months of hardship and difficult choices. Food shortages led to exorbitant prices. A pound of tea could cost $100 in today's money. Smallpox outbreaks spread terror through the crowded town. Loyalist families faced ostracism or worse from their Patriot neighbors, while Patriot sympathizers risked imprisonment or confiscation of property. The siege created divisions that would persist long after the war ended, as neighbors remembered. Who had supported which side during those trying months? The military innovations born during the siege would echo throughout the war. The colonial use of earthworks and field fortifications at Breed's Hill and Dorchester Heights previewed tactics that would bedevil British forces for years. The logistical systems developed to supply the Continental Army around Boston became models for later campaigns. Even the medical services, though primitive by modern standards, established patterns for treating wounded soldiers that would be refined at Valley Forge and beyond. Perhaps the siege's most enduring legacy was its demonstration that the American Revolution would not be a short-lived protest but a protracted struggle. The British had assumed the show of force would quickly restore order. The colonists had feared the same. The siege proved both sides wrong, establishing the pattern for 7 more years of conflict. In this sense, the Siege of Boston was not just the first major military engagement of the Revolutionary War. It was the crucible in which both armies and both nations began to take shape. The echoes of those 11 months can still be heard in American military doctrine. The blending of regular and irregular forces, the importance of terrain and fortification, the value of perseverance against a seemingly superior foe, all found their first full expression in the hills and harbors around Boston. When modern American soldiers study their heritage, they trace a direct line from today's army back to those determined volunteers who held the line at Cambridge and Dorchester. Siege also marked a watershed in political leadership. Washington's ability to maintain his army through that first desperate winter established his reputation for steadfastness that would sustain the revolutionary cause. The Continental Congress's support for the siege, despite enormous financial and logistical challenges, demonstrated that representative government could wage war effectively. Even at the local level, the committees that organized supplies and intelligence for the siege became prototypes for the civil institutions of the new nation. In the broader sweep of history, the Siege of Boston represents one of those rare moments when military action and political revolution converged perfectly. The colonial forces around Boston were not just fighting against British soldiers. They were fighting for the idea that they could govern themselves. Every day the siege continued was a day that idea grew stronger, both in America and abroad. By the time the British sailed away in March 1776, the question was no longer whether there would be an American Revolution, but only how far it would spread and how much it would change the world. The tactical details of the siege, the placement of batteries, the skirmishes and sorties, the engineering feats and logistical nightmares all matter less than this fundamental truth. At Boston, the American colonies proved they could sustain resistance against the greatest military power of the age. That proof would inspire patriots from New Hampshire to Georgia, terrify loyalists who had banked on British invincibility, and tempt European powers to join the fray. The shots fired at Lexington had started the war, but the siege of Boston made it revolutionary. As the last British transports disappeared over the horizon that March morning, few could have imagined that this was just the beginning of an 8-year global conflict that would stretch from Savannah to Gibraltar, from the Caribbean to India. But looking back, we can see how those months of encirclement and endurance set the pattern for the entire Revolutionary War. A pattern of British overconfidence meeting American determination, of imperial power frustrated by local knowledge, of professional armies challenged by citizen soldiers. The siege of Boston was where the American Revolution grew from a protest into a war, and from a war into a nation. The men who stood watch in those makeshift fortifications through the bitter winter of 1775-76 could not know they were making history. They knew only that they were cold, hungry, and far from home, yet unwilling to yield. In their stubborn refusal to back down, they established the character of the army and the nation that would emerge from this conflict. The Siege of Boston was many things: a military engagement, a political statement, a test of wills. But above all, it was the moment when American resistance became American Revolution.